Well, we're starting to see meaningful gains regarding Democratic messaging and willingness to have uncomfortable conversations because former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg sat down for a 3-hour conversation with the quote-unquote MAGA bros of the Flagrant podcast hosted by MAGA-friendly comedian Andrew Schulz, a podcast that Donald Trump was recently on before he was reelected. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, I definitely recommend that you watch this full 3-hour conversation because it seemed like Buttigieg's wit, his information, his knowledge, his just affable, gentle demeanor, and his willingness to have the conversation and answer questions really won over the Flagrant podcast bros, including Andrew Schulz. So definitely watch the whole thing. But I want to play you some clips here, starting with this one.
I want everyday life to be better.
That's what they want too.
You get up in the morning. Yeah, but importantly, all the controversies are over what that's like. I want you to be able to get up in the morning and the first thing you do is you commute to work. And by the way, if you're on an EV, I want that to be affordable for you. Or if you're on public transit, not to get back into the subway situation, but I want you to have good public transit to get to where you're going. And then when you get to that job, I want you to be paid well. And if you're about to have a kid, I want you to know that you're going to have parental leave when you have that kid. And if you don't want to have a kid, I want you to have the right to choose whether to have a kid, which means access to birth control and abortion and those things that give you the freedom to decide on that. And if you already have a kid, when you pick them up at school, I want that school to be good, not having its funding slashed while they set fire to the Department of Education. And then when you get home, I want you to be in a neighborhood that is safe and where you can breathe the air because we didn't let them get rid of the Clean Air Act. And you don't have to think for one moment about whether the air you breathe or the water you drink is clean and clear, which actually takes a lot because it means the government has to constrain those actors that would make you unfree by polluting the air and polluting the water. And then when you go to bed, I want you to know that your family's going to be fine, even if it's family like mine, despite there being some Supreme Court justice who wants to obliterate your family because it doesn't match his interpretation of his religion. That's the life I want everybody to be able to live.
Yeah, I think
we can deliver that.
That's fine.
Cut that, and we did. People did, and we're sharing that clip. That is Pete Buttigieg when pressed to give an affirmative vision of what specifically would life look like under optimal Democratic leadership. That's what he did. That was a hell of a mini rant that was so, artfully delivered. It was so substantively great, both on the merits and the delivery. Excellent. And again, they're happy with it. They love to hear that. So the Democratic messengers, people like Pete Buttigieg, AOC, Bernie Sanders, Jake Auchincloss, Jasmine Crockett, they should be going on these shows. They really should. Because remember, Pete Buttigieg is no longer in office. He is a former transportation secretary. He is currently out of government office. He declined to run or announce his bid to run for senator in Michigan, which is where he currently lives. He might run for president in 2028. He's kind of coy about that. But again, that was beautiful in terms of an affirmative vision. Buttigieg did extremely well. I want to play you some other clips, though, where he goes after the Republicans as only Pete Buttigieg can. Not cruel, not being a jerk about it the way that I probably would if the shoe was on the other foot. I want to give you some examples where he makes the case that Republicans are not living up to their expectations, and they actually have a terrible vision for the country.
Because I think the folks who are saying government got this wrong, which might be true any number of times, what they're really saying is the policies of this person in government got it wrong, but they don't have an answer. Their answer is burn it all down, right? If we haven't solved poverty, their answer is we're going to slash Medicaid, which is what the Republican budget moving through Congress right now will do, is slash Medicaid. Medicaid may not be perfect. In fact, I know for a fact, many issues come up in the way it's administered, the way people have access to it. But I also know for a fact that if your answer to that is just to cut out a bunch of poor people, or VA, any veteran can tell you the horror stories of all the times things didn't go right in dealing with the VA. But if you think the answer is to just cut it or privatize it, that's not an answer. Right. We can do better than that.
Again, a great point. Drawing also contemporaneous examples, talking about how the current Republican budget agenda will effectively amount to a staggering loss in Medicaid, a staggering cut to Medicaid, no matter how they dress it up. Oh, we're looking for waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, you haven't found evidence of billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars of waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. You were just assuming that that's the case and already putting into law or attempting to put it into law these cuts to it without proving that the cuts are necessary, because you are trying to cut Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, these quote unquote entitlement programs, the social safety net programs that people pay into. And I love how he uses that example to draw it in. Like, hey, this is going on right now. These aren't just examples in the past. This is going on right now and can be stopped with sufficient political pressure. So I love that. He also, Pete Buttigieg did, went after DOGE during this conversation in a really persuasive way to, again, these MAGA bro podcasts. And I shouldn't say that. Andrew Schulz is definitely the most MAGA friendly out of all of them. I don't know the political persuasions of some of the others. They seemed even more amenable to Buttigieg's position on politics. But certainly it is a space. Certainly Flagrant has a lot of viewers who are MAGA and MAGA friendly, and Schulz himself fairly MAGA friendly as well. So this is Pete Buttigieg taking on DOGE.
Usually, like the data are like based on some real set that the data somebody gathered.
It can be manipulated.
But yeah, how it looks or how you make it sound. Yeah. I mean, they're doing this right now. Again, the DOGE stuff, they make it sound like there's like millions of dead people getting Social Security.
Exactly.
We're just not. That is just not true.
So how many are there dead people? That's because this seemed to me fact.
Well, first of all, like
Biden can get it.
Look, I mean, one thing to think about is like, obviously the vast majority of people who die of old age are getting Social Security the day they die, right? Mm-hmm. So like for at least a minute or a week or a month or however long it takes, right? There's that process of updating. But part of it had to do with how the database was built. And you just didn't necessarily like remove everybody from the database. It didn't mean they were getting money, but it meant they were in the database. And so you could twist that into looking like this is what the president did in his speech. Like, it's true there's this database that had all these people from like, 100 years ago. It was not true that they were getting checks. Okay.
Wow.
But he said the one part. That's good. And your brain fills in the blanks. And now you think, oh shit, there's like millions of people who are 150 years old getting checks, which is not true.
Yeah. He's referring to the COBOL system, right? Where again, people who died would not be taken out of the system, but they would not be given checks. I mean, Social Security is an immaculately run institution. There have been multiple inspectors general investigations and reviews of Social Security, because we do actually like to cut waste, fraud, and abuse as a general proposition in the federal government. You can say, well, we don't do a good enough job, and fair enough, but that's what the inspectors general are for under Republican and Democratic administrations, including Trump's administration, including the first term, right? And Social Security fraud is like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a rounding error by comparison. So this idea that, millions of, dead people or hundreds of thousands of dead people are getting Social Security checks or in perpetuity or what, it's just nonsense. It really is, for the reasons that Pete Buttigieg lays out. Now, this clip is a little bit longer, but I think it also goes really, really hard. I think Buttigieg does a great job. So we're going to play it and talk about it on the other side.
Goes into or is supposed to go into here in the U.S. is what then turns around and makes it possible for businesses to thrive.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, my favorite example is probably the smartphone. So have you ever noticed like in like talks or like whenever somebody mentions a smartphone, they like start to pull it out of their pocket or like, touch it. But so the federal government could not have invented the iPhone, right? Like I don't think any of us would want a phone that was like invented by the federal government.
That thing would suck.
That is like all of the design, the manufacturing, supply chains. That's the kind of thing that corporations can do very well. Yeah. And Apple did it very well, and their competitors. But what makes the iPhone work? Well, among other things, the internet. The internet was literally invented by a federal research project. And it would never have been possible to invent the internet with a private company, because you wouldn't have got the kind of capital return, even though it's a $1 trillion idea or a multi-trillion dollar idea. Companies can do multi-billion dollar ideas, but $1 trillion idea, like inventing the internet, that requires basic research. And that's the kind of thing the government's supposed to do, among many other things.
It requires basic research? What does that mean?
Yeah, by basic research, I mean things that are so fundamental that you actually don't know for 50 or 100 years if they're going to have a return. They might never work out.
Oh, right? Yeah. You can't look at it as this thing is going to be profitable. It has to be
so it's different
benevolent endeavor for society.
Yeah, it's different from research on like a pharmaceutical company researches a new medication, expecting that they're going to
there's going to be a return in the next 10, 20 years.
Right, at least kind of within the profit rate.
Yeah. But public parks is another version of this and stuff like that. Yeah, you can't privatize the public park.
Right, this is the whole idea of public goods. Right? This is why we have governments, why we collect taxes.
God, we're turning into such libs already, dude.
But there's a handshake, right? There are the things that only the government can do, and then there are the things that the private sector can and should do, and they meet in the middle. But if you start shorting, and part of what really worries me right now about this kind of war on academia, and there are some things about academia that need to change, but the war on academia, the cuts to cancer research, the cuts to science research, this kind of like general anti-science like atmosphere that I think is emanating from the administration. Like that costs us in ways that don't show up on, a corporate profit and loss statement 6 months from now or a year from now. But in terms of whether a country, a society, an economy is productive and is growing and is innovating, that starts to really cost you over time. And if we're shorting that, or if corporations and extremely wealthy people don't want to be paying into that through taxes, that is, I think, a classic example of a kind of short-term gain that causes long-term pain.
Very few Democratic messengers could make that case as artfully, as quickly, as concisely, again, extemporaneously. He's not reading off a script. And it's important because so many people are like, well, Donald Trump's a businessman, again, with a very mixed record. And we should run government like a business. Well, no, we shouldn't. Like, you actually have to show where that's the case, because the point of a business, they have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders to make profits and to maximize profits. That's not what the federal government does. The government is not in it to make a profit. And I'll point out, as Sam Cedar from the Majority Report has pointed out time and time again, that if your goal in terms of efficiency is, okay, well, we want to spend less to make more money, well, then you wouldn't defund like the Internal Revenue Service, which for every $1 it spends, it gets 4 back. So it's one of the most revenue positive elements of the federal government, and conservatives and Republicans are eager to defang it. So they clearly aren't interested in running the federal government like a business. Or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which compared to a relatively paltry sum in terms of funding, has returned billions of dollars, $20 billion, I think, to the American people, if I remember that statistic correctly. But it's also revenue positive. And yet Elon Musk's D.O.G.E effectively shut it down because it was, the quote unquote cops on Wall Street. They would go after big corporations who were defrauding the American people. So not only is the premise flawed for the reasons that Buttigieg lays out, but even if you accept the premise at face value, it's total bullshit, because the Republicans aren't running the government that way. They are actually defanging and neutering the most revenue positive, financially responsible aspects of the federal government. So I love it. He did such a good job. You should definitely check it out. And again, hopefully this is an encouraging sign that more Democratic lawmakers in the House and the Senate and aspiring presidential political candidates will go on Flagrant and have a conversation. I think it's really, really good. And I think, quite frankly, we have no choice, even if we'd prefer not to. So in the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.